Affairs, and Bobby Manis is the policy director for the Office of the Lieutenant Governor, Juliana Stratton. And so today's presentation and discussion is just to summarize the Governor's Rural Affairs Council, and Norm is going to give a background briefing onto the formation, the rationale, and why it's kind of a unique entity really in the United States, really an important entity for promoting rural development. I'm going to talk about the 2021 annual report of the Governor's Rural Affairs Council, and then Bobby will be here to engage in conversation about the Lieutenant Governor's vision for rural development. So a quick background then is I'm going to very quickly here pass things over to Norm to talk about the background of the GRAC. We'll move to the current time and talk about what's gone on very recently in the GRAC. We'll talk about some demographic trends, some of the 3 working groups, and then engage attendees in a conversation. So Norm, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. See if I can my video going here. Am I on or not? I guess I am. Okay. Yep. Essentially, the history on this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I think it's important to understand why, how the Rural Affairs Council was created and why it made Illinois really in the lead in the 1970s, really among states. And this was, and I don't say this in just kind of a bragging kind of moment, because other states actually came to Illinois looking at the system, New York and a number of other places. And so I think understanding how it came about and what the implications might be as we look ahead. And that's the big issue, is as we're in a new era now, and rural, as you heard from a number of presentations earlier today, rural really has some great opportunities, but it's going to be basically because we make them happen. It's not going to be because they just are going to fall in our lap. So to start the conversation, in 1986, we were just following a significant agricultural crisis, and some farms were being sold, and there were bankruptcies and just all kinds of serious issues. And so many of the small towns sort of said, well, gee, is this the end of rural or end of our future in small towns? And as a result, Governor Thompson and Lieutenant Governor George Ryan created a task force on the future of rural Illinois. And this started in 1986. It ran for 5 to 6 months. And it was essentially, it was bipartisan. It had about 25 members. The co-leaders were one Democrat, one Republican. They were from ag industry, cattle ranch or operation, cattle raising operation, and the president of Knox College was the other co-leader. So it included about 20 to 25 staff members, not staff members, but actual members of there. Was I unmuted?
Okay, sorry about this. It looks like somehow the rooms were terminated. They still are there. You're still assigned to them, it looks like. So I just need to open them all again. One thing I'm going to do is turn off the breakout rooms close automatically, and I will watch that manually now. If you are a moderator or a speaker that has co-host, please do not use any of the options in the breakout rooms. Please only look for your room to join. That might have been what happened. So I'm going to open all rooms again, and you can go back into them.
Do we want to re-record, Chris? We'll have to start over again, right?
Can you see the slide presentation there, Norm?
Yeah, looks fine.
Okay,
You can hear me okay?
there we go. I think we're, sorry about that hiccup. I think we're back.
Shall we start over again?
I think we're okay.
Okay, well,
I mean, yes, you start it. You start again. That would be great.
okay. Right, the background then on the Governor's Rural Affairs Council is that in the middle 1980s, 1986 in this case, we were in a situation. We had just followed a major ag crisis. There were closing of farms, bankruptcies and so forth. It was basically an overextension of credit by the banks and financial institutions to some agricultural groups. And in some respects, it has some parallels with what's going on now. Farmland prices were, verging up, going up and so forth, and earlier times causing investment, and then the situation changed completely. So essentially, in 1986, the Governor Jim Thompson and Lieutenant Governor George Ryan created a task force on the future of rural Illinois. And the task force was to try to determine what sort of options do we have in rural Illinois to make rural Illinois better, and what kind of things do we need for state policies in order to make this happen. So essentially, the task force had about 25 participants. It was chaired by the governor of, the president of Knox, and a cattle farm person in Southern Illinois. So it was a bipartisan group, and the task force essentially held about 25 meetings around the state with rural leaders, a lot of evening meetings, and really down with the very local kind of people. And I'm not sure how many total people testified, but there was quite a bit. So we took testimony. It also had some staff members from, there were 4 universities were asked to contribute faculty members. It was U of I, UC, SIU, Northern, and Western. And so most of us participated in the meetings and took notes, and each took a particular assignment. And mine was the economic development and transportation, for example. So essentially, the task force held these meetings. We had deliberations and met and everything. And in about early 1987, it was in January, as I recall, we ended up finishing up the material and generating a report, a rural revitalization initiative. And this, the initiative essentially was a statewide trust. It was an executive order by the governor's creating of the Governor's Rural Affairs Council, executive order by the governor. There was a House and Senate joint resolution supporting this initiative. So it had support from both houses of the General Assembly. And this report contained primarily some desired strategies, guidelines, but then also some recommended policies that needed to happen in order to improve the delivery of services. And as part of this, it recommended that there be an agency within a university to conduct applied research and to look at best practices, to promulgate these kinds of efforts. And this is really what partly created this first annual conference. Now, the idea in the task force, really, after all these meetings and stuff, they decided that it wasn't a question that we didn't have enough state programs. It was a question that the programs simply were not coordinated. And the difficulty was that many of the small town officials that testified before the task force basically said, if we go to call agency X, we can transfer it a dozen times. We don't really know what we're trying to do. My day job is running a restaurant. My night job, a couple of days a week, is being mayor of a small town. So it's a question of I just can't navigate the myriad of activities in Springfield. And so the idea of the council then was, what could we do in order to streamline that process and to provide an entree point for these small town officials, and again, limited expertise? How do we get them to the appropriate state agency on the right issue in as fast a time as we can? So essentially, what came out of this then was the annual conference to talk about best practices, and this is the 33rd one we're doing now. There was a preparation of a rural resource guide then in the future. There was a creation of a governor's office or governor's rural affairs council. And that council was basically a state agency. It was funded by both general revenue funds as well as ag premium funds to have a link with agriculture. It had a staff in those days. It was 4 full-time professionals, you know, each one having a different area like economic development, transportation, health, these kinds of things. And it had 2 support personnel that were basically responding to requests from local leaders about programs. So in essence, the rural mayor or somebody could call up and say, you know, I've got an issue with railroad tracks in my town, and who do I contact in IDOT? And then the Rural Affairs Council would contact the appropriate person in IDOT and have that person get back to the mayor. And that was basically how the model worked initially. And the people that were the designated people in each agency had also been traveling with the Rural Affairs Council at the various meetings. So it was really a good network within state government. Okay, so that happened. Then the previous topics then over the years that the Rural Affairs Council has addressed. One was, as I mentioned, trying to promote the annual conference. Now these programs that were being done essentially were involving multiple state agencies. So the whole purpose of the General Rural Affairs Council, Governor's Rural Affairs Council, was really to coordinate state agencies. It wasn't just to have an individual agency doing something. It was agency A was supposed to be working with agency B on a problem that neither A or B would do otherwise. So the whole idea was to develop, to get missing links, if you would, or things that would have fallen through the gaps. Okay, so it involved developing a rural resource guide. The Institute for Rural Affairs coordinated that with the various agencies. It had a value-added agriculture initiative initially, and that was to make agriculture more economic development related. And it was Department of Commerce and Community Affairs. That was the title of DCEO in those days, but it was DECA and agriculture. It linked healthcare with local economic development issues, and again, Department of Commerce and IDPH. And then trying to find some innovative methods to finance essential businesses that were closing, and that was DCEO and a number of Institute for Rural Affairs, various agencies, and then modernizing the delivery of local public services. The idea there was that we are shrinking in population, so the same governmental structure costing the same amount of money, but paid for by fewer people, isn't going to work. So basically, Illinois had very high property tax rates, either number 2 in the country, depending on how New Jersey was. So essentially, are there ways to somehow streamline or modernize the system of delivering services? So that was another thing that it took on. Now, these are just examples and just kind of a background as to what was trying to be done. But the Governor's Rural Affairs Council now has lasted for 35 years. So I think that's pretty remarkable. When we put it initially, New York was kind of a leader in trying to do some. They had a joint commission on rural issues, and the person who ran that commission in New York actually came and spent a day or 2 in Illinois looking at what we were doing. So what Illinois had done was created the Governor's Rural Affairs Council, and then in companion with that, had a university-based agency, the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs, to do the research, and then was promoting the formation of a state rural development council as rural partners. And so essentially we had a 3-pronged approach to addressing rural kinds of issues. And that really is the basis for what's been going on. And again, it's 35 years later, you know, topics change, issues changes, you know, the format has changed a bit, funding probably. So that's pretty much to bring you up to speed as to what's going on. And then Chris is going to talk a little bit about an annual report. I didn't mention one of the responsibilities of BRAC was to provide an annual report to the governor and the General Assembly to talk about what is the status of rural, and then what policies do we need to have happen to make it work. So, Chris.
All right, thank you, Norm. And again, and thanks for your leadership. You were in at the ground floor, you're a charter member, and so really grateful for your ongoing participation. So I'm just going to breeze through some slides. We'll talk about some, again, a little bit of the current composition of the GRAC. We'll talk about some demographics, the working groups, and then we'll open it up for conversation and questions that you might have. There's a governor's executive order that, as Norm was saying, that sort of stipulates some obligations that the GRAC has and the Institute for Rural Affairs have, including developing and implementing strategies for improving how we deliver services to rural communities in an annual report and so forth. Currently, the composition of the GRAC, again, chaired by Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. We have 16 agencies. Some of the acronyms have changed. It used to be DECA and it's now DCEO. Rural Partners was mentioned, and we also have citizen members as well, including Norm in his semi-retired state, which isn't very retired if you know Norm. So some of the basic activities, we are holding quarterly meetings. We have 3 working groups. The annual conference, the GRAC is hosting a webinar with Hunt Institute focused on education, and many of those seminars are focused on rural education, and then research as part of the Institute. Part of its obligation to the GRAC and part of its obligation to Lieutenant Governor is to maintain a research agenda on rural issues. So some of the demographic trends, and part of the talking about demography is also about how you present these data. And so obviously the population of rural Illinois, non-metro Illinois, has declined. But the point that I like to make repeatedly is that, at around 1.4 million, that's larger than 10 states. In other words, rural Illinois is a significant segment of the population, and it's also a significant territory, a geography. And so that's why rural matters. There's a lot of people and a lot of landscape, and consequently, because of that, it merits attention by the state government. Some of the demographic trends, talking about decline, we do see that the metro counties are growing, some long-term rural population decline, but as was noted earlier today, some of those counties that used to be rural actually flipped to urban, so because of commuting zones, so talking about the rural-urban connectivity. And then also that rural still represents a significant portion of the Illinois population. And a majority of the Illinois counties are non-metro. And this is just a snapshot showing that international migration is a significant part of population stabilization. And we've heard several comments today about diversity and sort of the changing demographic landscape, who is living in rural areas. And I think for sort of long-term resilience of rural communities, I think we need to be more welcoming because to diverse populations, because it's this in-migration of international migrants, for example, is what is stabilizing or keeping our population decline from being worse than it otherwise would be. I'm going to intersperse some of more demographics in with our discussion of our work groups, but let me go back to this slide. So 3 working groups: an education and workforce development working group, health and broadband, and then economic development and infrastructure. Some of the challenges that we as a GRAC identified within education and workforce development include a rural-urban educational attainment gap, a rural-urban wage gap, and a rural-urban workforce development gap. And so some of the issues, some specific approaches include improving access to education and then aligning workforce development plans with curriculum, particularly K-12 and community college. So, thinking about trends in educational attainment, for those not completing high school, we're seeing that rural is narrowing the gap with urban. Completing college, it's sort of a mixed story here, right? So how do we frame this? We know that there's an increasing proportion of rural young folks who are completing college, but the rural-urban gap continues to grow. So, but in absolute terms, we are getting better as in rural areas of getting our young people to community college, to post-secondary education, whatever that might be. The wage gap, and it's hard to say what this means entirely, but we do see over time, of course, the horizontal axis is showing, starting at the year 2000, and looking at the average wages in Illinois, and you see that the gap has persisted and actually widened a little bit. These dollars are in inflation-adjusted dollars to 2020, and so one might say, well, the lower wages might be okay because cost of living might be lower in some instances, and that's probably true. But if we are interested in keeping our young people here, I think we do need to be thinking about how we increase wages in rural Illinois. Just thinking about workforce, again, workforce development is a key issue in the GRAC, and trying to figure out what to do about the fact that the rural workforce is shrinking relative to the urban workforce, and shrinking in real terms. And so there's a question here of how do we keep young people here? There's an interrelatedness with the opioid misuse issue. If young people can't pass a random test, this is going to hurt the young person trying to find a job, and it's hurting the business trying to hire a person. So there's a complexity here to the rural workforce development issue that the GRAC is trying to tackle. Education and workforce actions. So what are we doing? And I was talking about the Hunt Institute, and so the Lieutenant Governor's Office has been partnering with the Hunt Institute to showcase a number of webinars talking about for example, building a pipeline of higher education students, talking about rural students of color. So linking the earlier questions of diversity with educational access, and of course, digital divide issues profoundly affect educational performance in rural areas. And just sort of while not directly an action of the GRAC, but a direct action of GRAC members, is that during the COVID pandemic, there was this recognition early on that there was this persistent digital divide. And so rural Wi-Fi hotspots were created, and the Illinois Community College Board and DCO partnered with the DCO Office of Broadband specifically to create a map of drive-up Wi-Fi hotspots. And so it's kind of a cool map that you can, if you're interested, you can obviously search for that. Healthcare. Obviously, there's an aging, shrinking rural population, and then, of course, COVID and opioid misuse. So obviously a complex issue, and so the improving access to telehealth is one of the key responses, as well as addressing opioid misuse. And just some data on the map on the left is giving you a sense of the two most rural areas of this part of the state. West Central Illinois and Southern Illinois is also where the median age is higher. And so, of course, as we age, healthcare issues become more complex. So that's why an aging population in a rural area is sort of a compounded problem. And then, a very current issue of vaccination rates. And we know that there's a rural-urban divide there, which is also the vaccination rate differential is also an economic development issue as well. So moving forward a little bit is, how do we document this? And obviously the DCO Office of Broadband is doing great work documenting this. The U.S. Census Bureau can provide just a quick snapshot. This is a map showing internet subscription rates by county. And you can see there's certainly a north-south geography differential, but there's obviously clearly a very rural versus urban differential in percentage of households that have an internet subscription. And this goes to the point that, and many of us are talking about this now, but broadband is not just a luxury item. Of course, broadband is now we should be viewing it as infrastructure in the same way that we view sewer and water. Broadband should be viewed in that category, I would argue, and I think people on the GRAC would also argue that. And so what are some actions? And I think I saw Laura Kessel here earlier, but she's been working to pilot a couple of telemedicine hotspots to increase accessibility for people who may not be able to get to a clinic or to a hospital, but there may be a confidential place in the community with great access to broadband where telehealth could be made accessible. U of I Extension has been working on promoting vaccinations. And then we've been doing a lot of research, which is available on the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs website. So we've been trying to look at, what's the monetary value of telemedicine? Who is using telemedicine? How can we expand people's awareness of telemedicine would be some of the research topics we've been doing. Shifting that to the economic development and infrastructure recommendations, and obviously echoing with what was going on in the healthcare subcommittee, but a broadband, but also rural quality of life, business succession planning as, really looking at the Main Street economy when a business owner gets to a certain age, they're looking to retire. How do we help that store owner get a fair price for selling their business and find a new person to come in to take over that business? Because otherwise that successful business shuts down, and that's not good for the Main Street economy. And then obviously the COVID pandemic, yes, it's a public health issue, but it's also an economic development issue. And so, I show this map. This is employment by industry as a percent of total. And it's really looking at metro versus non-metro counties in the state of Illinois. And what I'm trying to show here is that many people might assume that if it's rural, it must be agriculture. And it's absolutely true that agriculture is a key and important and a foundational part of the rural economy. But as I'm showing in this graph here with the yellow arrow, what you would see is that proportionately speaking, rural is more dependent on manufacturing than urban, which is probably surprising to many people. And that's why workforce development is such an important issue. And it's also why, as we think about what Ernie Goss was saying earlier about fluctuations in commodity prices and agriculture, and there was a certain message about volatility, and so that if you're concerned about volatility within a particular economic sector, the way you manage that is through diversification, and I think that's part of what workforce development is through the GRAC, is trying to figure out how do we diversify. We support agriculture, resource extraction, a very important part of the downstate Illinois economy, but we also want to maintain and expand, if possible, manufacturing, trade and transportation, and so forth. So it's about economic diversification. And then this map is talking about self-employment, which is another really important strategy for rural Illinois. And what this is a map is a little bit old, from 2018, but it's based on a survey done by the Small Business Administration. It's looking at percentage of self-employment by county. And the two yellow arrows, I hope, give you the sense that West Central and Southeast Illinois, in other words, the more rural you are, the more likely you are probably going to see people who are working for themselves, whether it's a restaurant or automotive repair, whatever it might be. So entrepreneurship is a really important part of the rural economy. But then you can see the interconnectedness with other issues. Obviously, broadband is a key part of this, and then also the impact of COVID on small business as it's affecting rural small business. So thinking further about economic development and infrastructure conditions. So again, looking at the gap between income, and so looking at per capita income growth, looking at earnings per job, there's a gap. It is growing in rural versus urban areas, but the gap is still persisting. And then the poverty rate is, there's also a gap, but we are working on that, I suppose. And I don't want to deal too much with this slide, but one of the areas of research, what we are trying to do is we're trying to figure out to what extent does COVID have a differential impact on rural versus urban communities based on the kinds of businesses that you might be most likely to find in rural versus urban communities. And so, what we did is we looked at industrial sector code, NAICS codes, and then looking at employment losses based on those industrial sectors. And then, not surprisingly, the graph, or the table with the blue highlighted title, you can see the industries most likely to be affected by the COVID pandemic. And then we could sort of make a geographical projection on which counties might be most likely to be affected by the COVID. And so we're sort of at a point now where we want to follow up to see if our projections are true. But the broader point is that the GRAC and our constituent members, what we're trying to do is conduct research, meaningful research that we can take action on when appropriate. So business succession planning was one of the issues that we identified within the GRAC, and so one of the actions that the Institute for Rural Affairs did. Each elected official in Congress and the Senate is able to make a congressionally designated expenditure request. So a request that we made to Representative Sherry Bustos was a $400,000 request to promote new business startups with an emphasis on minority startups, procurement, so business expansion through procurement, and then finally, sort of a business sustainability through business succession planning. And Representative Bustos chose our project. Of course, we need a federal budget in order for this to be funded, so we'll wait and see. But we've taken action because we think in rural areas, business succession planning is very important. And then, of course, DCO is a key partner within the GRAC, and they've been very invested in helping companies, businesses across the state recover from COVID. And so we, along with many other agencies across the state, received the Community Navigator grant to work with businesses in underserved and remote communities. And so this is a map of our outreach area, all rural counties, and trying to help these businesses gain access to state funding so that they can bounce back from COVID. And another initiative is related to infrastructure and broadband. And this is an example of how the GRAC works. The DCEO hired an individual by the name of Matt Schmidt from Minnesota, actually. He had been a state representative, I think, in Minnesota, who was just a really strong advocate for broadband expansion in Minnesota. He was working at the working on public policy issues at the University of Minnesota, and it was an expert in the expansion of rural broadband. And DCO hired him away to come to Illinois to be the director of the DCO Office of Broadband. And back in, I think it was 2019, Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton invited Matt Schmidt to give a presentation about his vision for broadband expansion in rural areas. And so this is one of the key roles of the GRAC, is to bring leaders in economic development and share that knowledge with other agencies as well. And one of the sort of further connections that was made through this GRAC was a connection to the Illinois Innovation Network, which is a system of public university, it's a network of public universities in the state of Illinois. And DCO then created the DCO Ready grant program to use the Illinois Innovation Network as a driver of broadband expansion. And so this was an initiative that was really catalyzed by the Office of the Lieutenant Governor and the GRAC. And we are just, the Institute for Rural Affairs is just one of 10 grantees. It's a relatively small grant, but, and this is kind of going back to something Norm introduced long ago, is really the importance of our anchor institutions in rural areas. And this is a sort of an ongoing conversation that we have in the GRAC, how important anchor institutions are, whether it's a grocery store, the local school, healthcare facility, and libraries. And so again, after many years of working with libraries, we come back again to help further push out broadband utilization and digital literacy through the DCO Ready Grant program. And some of our partners include some of the library system organizations, planning agencies, community colleges, but the same kind of library partnership broadband expansion is going on in Northern Illinois and in far Southern Illinois. And I would argue that this kind of expansion would not have happened if not for the leadership of the Lieutenant Governor and the GRAC. So some of the research that we've been doing, again, in support of the GRAC, obviously marijuana sales are legal in Illinois, and we've been doing research on tax revenue generation and looking at whether or not sort of proportionally are rural or urban areas doing better in terms of collecting taxes and reinvesting those taxes locally. We've been looking at the economic impact of COVID-19, and also looking at the ways that COVID has maybe differentially affected minority versus non-minority business owners. And if you're interested, there's more information available on our website. So last slide, just a summary. We've identified, that is to say the GRAC has identified a lot of issues, right? An aging and declining population, educational attainment gap, digital divide, but linking back to our presentations earlier this morning is, yes, this is kind of a needs-based list. Maybe a better ways to reframe this, right? How do we understand these processes, but make something positive out of them? So that leads then to looking forward and thinking about next steps, including a pilot telehealth project, broadband expansion, and more research, and then sort of pondering new ways to deliver services to rural communities. So that's all I have. I would certainly welcome Norm and Bobby to follow up, or we can open this up to questions.
I would suggest, Bobby, if you want to say some things, and then we can have an open discussion with the audience.
Thank you. I don't have much to add. I want to lift up the work of Dr. Norman Walser, Dr. Chris Merritt, as well as excited to go back towards some of the roots of the GRAC, thinking about coordination across stakeholders, including agencies, about resources that are available, trying to make sure that rural communities across the state, one, know about the resources that are available, but also are able to be directed right to those resources. So I want to thank again the leaders who presented, Laura Kessel, who has been a real leader on the GRAC for the last few years as well. And with that, I can turn to questions from those who are watching.
Yeah, I guess let me ask you one question, Bobby, as the policy director. I mean, the Lieutenant Governor comes from Chicago, and I know I don't want to ask you to put your words in her mouth, but I'm wondering what would be some of the surprising things, because my sense is Lieutenant Governor has really taken a deep dive on rural and downstate issues. I mean, I know she was a state rep. She would have been in Springfield. She would have rubbed shoulders with people like Andy Minar, right? People who have born and raised in downstate. But what would you suppose, and maybe I could just say, in general for your staff, as you've embraced the mission of the GRAC, what are some of the surprising things that you've seen?
I think some of the great surprises have been how comparable specific challenges are for urban, suburban, and rural communities. I know that as a state rep, Lieutenant Governor Stratton was thinking about access to broadband and about food insecurity. And she was thinking about that certainly for the state, but really for the area that she was representing, which included a good amount of the south side of Chicago. And I think that the switch from state rep to lieutenant governor and the leadership that is essentially required for lieutenant governors of the Governor's Rural Affairs Council has really kind of shown a through line of challenges around food insecurity and around like access to broadband that are not just impacting urban communities and specifically communities that have been divested from, but really connect all of the state of Illinois. So I think learning about those challenges and figuring out how does the lieutenant governor and how does the state of Illinois address those challenges, thinking about some of the specific circumstances that are different between, say, urban and rural communities, but also the connection points has been really valuable. And I think has opened up her eyes, and I would say certainly has opened up my eyes to how the state can better address those issues and what it means to invest statewide, thinking about community-specific solutions.
So thank you, Bobby. Norm, maybe I would ask you a question. Just thinking about from your vantage point as being on the ground floor of the GRAC. I mean, what have been some of the, I'm not sure I'd call them victories, but kind of high points. What are some of the rewarding things that you've seen because of your association with the GRAC?
Well, they're not rewarding because of my association, but what I've seen, I think, over the years, if you need to think a little bit, I think about GRC is sort of a timeless or it's multi-year kind of approach. And so essentially what we do in year one, for example, may not really show up till year 3 or 4. But it's the idea that well, to take an early example, the value added. So we started a value added program, and that was really coming out of GRAC. It caused 2 agencies to work together that frankly wouldn't have worked together in this capacity before. So that continued over the next, probably still have it. I haven't looked lately, we probably still have a value added program. And I think it's the idea that we have people coming together with all this expertise, and they aren't really thinking about what am I going to do when I go home or back to my office this afternoon. But they're really thinking about what do we need to have in the future. As an example, the work by Benton Institute with education, I think, is excellent. We're opening the doors for a lot of rural kids to be able to get into higher education and fulfill, do better. And I think along that, we've also been asking, well, if they're going to do that, we want them to come back home. We don't want to just export to another larger center. So to get a college degree, we've now got to, at the same time, figure out what are new and better jobs we can have in rural areas. So it's that kind of, multidisciplinary thinking or whatever it is, but multifaceted thinking would mean that what we did in, say, 2 years ago with getting the education programs going, expanded, will show up 3 or 4 years from now as we're working to somehow have new industries. We're changing the mix in rural areas, and hopefully that mix will be more accommodating to people with higher educations or whatever. And when you look at the numbers, and I think a lot of people know this from discussions this morning, but rural is not rural. You can look at rural from employment, income, population, and you get different numbers. You can look at rural in the Rocky Mountain states versus Midwest, you get different numbers. So it's a question of how to have those programs flexible enough to be able to accommodate what people need in all kinds of situations. And I think the Rural Affairs Council, was able to do that because of the membership by the various agencies. And the key is that the members from Agency 1 are now in a meeting when they hear from agency 7 that they never would have talked to, or they wouldn't have talked to regularly. So you're seeing that pool of interaction that is really the key to the success of the Rural Affairs Conference. So I think it's been really, for me, it's been a very interesting situation. Things change over time, but I think it's the question I would raise now, though, is that, as we've talked before a little bit this morning, want to monopolize. The idea is we have got some good times potential for rural coming up. The question is, can we somehow get ahead of this and figure out what are the opportunities for rural Illinois, and then marshal the resources and the programs and the policies or whatever to put them in a position to do it. And that position is going to be needed in, say, a year when COVID kind of winds down, because it's not going to go back to 2018. It's going to be a new normal, and we got to be ready for it. And I think the Rural Affairs Council can do it.
Right. I guess a follow-up question. I mean, one of the implications of the GRAC Council is that rural is not just agriculture, right? That's the implication, I think, at least as director now for a while, is that a healthy farm economy needs a healthy rural non-farm economy, and so there's a symbiotic relationship there, and the idea of the GRAC is that yes, the Illinois Department of Agriculture is there, but so are 15 other agencies, which kind of implies that rural is this diverse and multifaceted, hard issue to resolve. And so I was thinking about Ernie Goss this morning with his really great presentation, talking about agriculture and the Main Street economy, and yet the more productive agriculture gets, the fewer farmers we need. And so there's a question of, how can the GRAC and a multifaceted approach address this issue of, we don't need as many people in agriculture or mining or forestry, but we want to sustain rural areas. So how do we, again, the GRAC is representative, sort of implicit is this idea that it's a multi-dimensional geographical construct, but how can the GRAC promote that idea that rural is diverse, rural needs to be diverse if it's going to be sustained?
I think it goes back to my earlier discussion of example of what GRAC had done, but the idea of bringing JECA and Department of Agriculture together and then focusing on value-added agriculture, which was really the idea of taking the agricultural products and not shipping them down the Mississippi River to some other country to process, but it was to process them locally. And I think it's that kind of thinking, and that originated in the GRAC, those discussions. And I think that's the kind of thing we're going to be looking at now. How do we take the natural resources in, I don't mean by just extractive resources, but the natural resources in rural, and how do we somehow combine them with commercial activities, health activities, other kind of things. Hemp is showing up now in hair shampoo and all kinds of different things. And so this is another example of a rural product that could be made locally in rural areas and then sold to larger centers. And I think that's kind of one of the futures of rural. And right. I think it's that same thing, but that can happen in GRAC.
Right. And I like the idea that, I think what you're implying is that rural is in fact, has great potential for innovation, for new ideas, new ways of doing things. And, I know you've been a big advocate of community supported enterprise and cooperatives. And we know that, the first grocery cooperatives emerged out of, workers, downtrodden workers in England who weren't being paid enough. And so they were sort of, well, how can we, buy through economies of scale? So let's aggregate ourselves. And let's innovate, right? We're not just individuals, as a group, we can innovate and we can survive. And I'm just sort of thinking, that's one of the things for the GRAC, I think, to embrace is the idea that rural can be innovative in a community supported agriculture. Community supported enterprise is a really good example of that. and I know the Lieutenant Governor was in Cairo. I was trying to think, is that 2 weeks ago? There was still snow on the ground on Cairo when we were down there. And you know, there was an initiative down there where people are talking about a community supported grocery store for a small town place that is missing an anchor institution. You know, the Institute for Rural Affairs was there, U of I Extension was there, the Office of the Lieutenant Governor was there, and it just seemed like, I mean, there was a food bank, there was just there was a consortium of interest, and that to me seems like that's what the spirit of the GRAC is bringing people together to solve these problems, and pretty good solutions, to be honest. I mean,
It was that, in going back to the very first days, it wasn't a question of if we need more programs. It was a question is we need to how to figure out a way to deliver them in a greater kind of way. And I think we're well ahead in 35 years, we're well ahead in that thought approach. And so, and the GRC is part of it.
And I guess that's all the conversation I had, Norma. Again, I'm just going to say thanks to you. You know, I'm the beneficiary of your vision from 35 years ago, and so I'm really grateful for your leadership. And Bobby, I've really been grateful to you and the Office of Lieutenant Governor for your support on, you know, I come to work in the morning and I go, I kind of like my job. We're making the world a slightly better place. So that, you know, that to me is part of the GRAC mission. So
Good news for me is when I left the Institute, it got bigger.
yeah, we've hit a couple of speed bumps, but we're doing great actually right now. And you know, the community support enterprise idea, which the Institute took on under your leadership, you know, I think we have grown that, but the spark came from you. So if there's no other comments or questions, I guess 2 o'clock, we're running up pretty close to a 2 o'clock end point, and there will be a break from 2 until 2:15 when the next round of plenary sessions will occur. So if there's no other comments, I'm just going to say thanks again to Norm and thanks again to Bobby.